Hello, my name is Cy Gart, and I want to talk today about one of my favorite subjects, DNA and the genetic code. There's a lot to say about that. I made an earlier video about DNA, giving some of the basics. But what I want to talk about today is something that I've been seeing and hearing on internet for some time, which is very puzzling to me, and I decided to investigate it. And that is an idea that has been circulating mostly through atheist channels, that DNA is not actually a language, doesn't really have information, and there is no such thing as a code. I was very surprised when I first saw this, and I wondered where the idea came from. It certainly didn't come from scientists. I should say right off the bat that the idea of a genetic code and that DNA carries information is not disputable in science. All biologists understand that this is true. It can be found in all textbooks. It's found throughout the literature. There are thousands of papers about the genetic code and the way DNA carries information. In trying to find out where this idea came from, I came across a video made in 2017 by the very well-known atheist philosopher, Stephen Woodford, or Rationality Rules, where he discusses the idea of DNA as a language. There's a link to the original video in the description, and I'm going to show a few clips of that video. After having watched it, I think I might have found the source of the confusion. Stephen's video indicates that he doesn't understand exactly what the genetic code is. He characterizes it in a way that's incorrect. Let's take a look at that.
Just as computer codes are rules that instruct elements on how to function and behave, DNA codes are rules that instruct cells on how to function and behave. But the difference between the two, and this is the crux of the confusion, is that computer code is written by an intelligent designer, that being a human, while DNA code is written by natural selection, that being nature unconsciously determining which codes remain in the gene pool.
So to repeat what Stephen said about the DNA code, he claims that computer code is written by an intelligent designer, namely human beings, while DNA code is written by natural selection. And then he goes on to say, nature unconsciously determines which codes remain in the gene pool. Just before that, Stephen says this is the crux of the confusion, and he's right. This is the crux of the confusion. But the confusion is Stephen's. Natural selection does not unconsciously determine which code remains in the gene pool. And I don't blame him for this mistake because it's a common mistake. The code is not the same as the sequence. The sequence of DNA is what determines your genetic makeup from mine. And our mutual genetic makeup is different from that of a tadpole or an oak tree because of the sequence of DNA. It's not the code. The genetic code is the same for me, you, tadpoles, and oak trees, and everything else that's alive, including bacteria. There is one genetic, universal genetic code, which, just like the Morse code, interprets what signs and symbols mean, like any other code. And these are arbitrary, just as the word tree, or albero, or baum, doesn't give any indication that it refers to a tall wooden plant with leaves on it. It's an arbitrary sound that people speaking different languages make to indicate the reality of what we call a tree. The same thing is true for the genetic code, and I discussed this in some detail in another video, which you can find on my channel. If he had said nature unconsciously determines which sequence remains in the gene pool, he would have been correct, because that's how evolution works. But that is not the case for the essence of the DNA language, which is the genetic code. That was determined at the origin of life, and we have no idea how that began. There's a lot of research looking into it, but we don't know the answer, and it's not going to be an easy answer to come up with. So if we want to see what is the difference between the sequence and a code, I have a couple of photos taken from my DNA Part 1 talk. This is one showing a typical DNA sequence, and you'll see red and green letters 4 letters, each of which symbolize one of the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA. These are chemicals, but we use their single letter abbreviations. This is not the genetic code. Some people think that the genetic code is using ATCG. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's simply a simple abbreviation. A stands for adenine, G stands for guanine, T for thymidine, and C for cytosine. And these occur in DNA in sequences. So the sequence of one of these double strands is AGTC, TG, ATGC, etc. And it has a complementary strand, and to understand that, please see my video, DNA Part 1. And that sequence is TCAGACTACG, and so on. That's the sequence, and that is, as I said before, that is what makes you and I different. Our DNA sequences are very, very similar, because we're both humans, I presume, but they're not identical. And those very small differences in the DNA sequence are what distinguish my characteristics from your characteristics. If you're a woman, for example, I have different chromosomes than you have. If you're very tall, much taller than I am, there's a gene that has something to do with height, which is different in you than it is in me, and so on. That is not the genetic code. That is the genetic sequence, which uses the genetic code to translate the sequence into the proteins that make us different. Here is the genetic code. The genetic code is a chart which tells us which set of 3 letters, of 3 nucleotides, which are called codons, code for which amino acids. So if we look at the very top, upper left, we see that TTT codes for phenylalanine. So does TTC. If we look at the ones that are circled, we see that CAT and CAC both code for histidine. And for threonine, anything that starts with AC, no matter what the 3rd letter is, codes for threonine. So whenever there is an ACT in the DNA sequence, that is a sign, a semiotic rule that says make a threonine next in the amino acid sequence of the protein you're building. This is the genetic code. And there's only one. The genetic code is universal from bacteria through us and everything in between. So I think that confusion that we have heard from Stephen is probably at the source of not only his own, but perhaps that of many other people who are confused, who are not scientists, who are not biologists, who are confused about what the genetic code is and what DNA sequences are. That confusion is easily removed by understanding that, yes, natural selection determines our sequence, our DNA sequences in every gene. Natural selection, as far as we know, is not related to the genetic code. It doesn't change with the change of environment. The genetic code is the same now as it was 3.5 billion years ago when life began. Let's take a look at what this argument, I think, is really all about. What I believe is that the argument that DNA is not information, there's no genetic code, etc., comes from is an attempt to counter a theistic argument which was articulated by Steve Meyer in The Signature in the Cell. And that argument goes something like this. The first premise would be DNA carries the symbolic information, like a language, which is translated by a complex biochemical system, which includes a universal genetic code, into all the characteristics of a living organism. In other words, its phenotype. That premise is fact. It's a scientific fact. And then the second premise would be that information in general, language in general, and all codes can only come from an intelligent agency and cannot arise spontaneously by natural physical-chemical processes. I happen to think that may be true, but it is not a scientific fact. It has not been proven, and there's a large field of scientific research into the origin and evolution of the genetic code. And then, of course, the conclusion is that, so therefore, the existence of the genetic code and the language of DNA are strong evidence for the existence of a creator God for life. What atheists, of course, object to is the conclusion, and the mistake that they make is rather than focusing on premise two, they seem to be conflating the two premises. So what they're doing is denying the reality of premise one. And I feel that's a terrible mistake. First of all, it goes against all of science, and it really amounts to a form of science denialism, no different from saying that the Earth is very young or is not round. So I think that I want to make this video not just so that other Christians and other theists can understand what the argument should be, but also for atheists to change their views on this very silly and I would say frankly ridiculous meme that there's no such thing as DNA as a code or a language. That's just is barking up the wrong tree and has no credibility or validity at all. Getting back to the video by Rationality Rules, the first part of the video, which I'm not going to show, talks about a number of things, but he also talks about the idea that, in fact, DNA is not a code, is not a language. And I believe that this may be true for many people who make this claim that premise one is false. So let's take a look at what Stephen says in this clip.
The assertion that DNA is a language is an equivocation fallacy, because its proponents switch between two different definitions of the word language throughout their premises, and thus their argument is incoherent and therefore invalid. To put this as simply as possible, during premise 1 and 3, they are using a communicational definition of the word language, which is a method of communication in which intended information is conveyed from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs and semiotic rules. But during premise 2, they are using a programming definition of the word language, which is a set of rules that instruct elements on how to function and behave. Now granted, on the surface these two definitions seem fairly synonymous, but in actuality they're not. The main difference between them is that the communicational definition necessitates that a mind receive, interpret, and decipher information, and thus it necessarily infers intelligence, while the programming definition does not necessitate that a mind receive, interpret, and decipher information, and thus it does not infer intelligence. Or, to put it more clearly, unlike English, math, and this video, DNA code isn't interpreted by anything. It's a set of rules and instructions that follow the physical laws of nature. It's a chemical reaction.
This part of his argument is not only wrong scientifically, it also doesn't make a lot of sense. Stephen gives a definition of the two kinds of language. Then he goes on to say that that's not what DNA is. DNA is a programming language, and he even admits that the definitions between the two seem similar. In fact, they do seem very similar. But then he claims they're quite different. He says that this kind of language, which he calls communication language, requires a mind. Now, looking at that definition again, I don't see the word mind. I see entity or group. And an entity does not have to be a mind, as far as I understand English. DNA is, in fact, related to a system which conveys information from one entity to another. The entity is the DNA itself, where it comes from. The other entity that the information is conveyed to is the ribosome, where proteins are synthesized by the protein synthesis system in translation. So I think that argument is basically flawed, but it has another problem, which is kind of strange, in that even if everything he said was true and DNA were simply a programming language, that wouldn't in any way negate the fact that DNA is an informational language. Sounds like it comes from an intelligent agency, because programming languages also come from intelligent agencies, namely us. I don't know any programming kind of language that arises spontaneously in the natural world without a human intervention. He then goes on to say that DNA is not a language of communication because no information is conveyed to any entity. And that is simply untrue scientifically. Let's take a look at what scientists say about this issue. I have here some quotes from two textbooks. The first is from a very standard textbook used in all molecular biology classes. So it's the relationship between a sequence of DNA and the sequence of the corresponding protein is called the genetic code. The genetic code is deciphered by a complex apparatus that interprets the nucleic acid sequence. So this doesn't come from some Christian apologist. This comes from a standard molecular biology textbook. And notice the words decipher and interpret, which are bolded. An even more, perhaps, famous textbook in molecular biology is The Molecular Biology of the Cell by Bruce Alberts et al. I've actually met Bruce Alberts, and I can testify he is in no way a theist. Let's read that one. The conversion of the information in messenger RNA represents a translation of the information into another language that uses quite different symbols. So in the standard textbooks, which every student learns about the genetic code from one or both of these textbooks, this is what we learn. And this is what I used to teach. Let's take a look at, this is one example of hundreds that I could have pulled from the literature, which is just from a particular paper that I found published in the Annual Review of Microbiology. The genetic code, the language used by cells to translate their genomes into proteins that perform many cellular functions, is highly conserved throughout natural life. I'm not saying that we should assume that because DNA is a language and because it carries information, that this proves that God exists. I believe it's a pointer to the existence of God, but that's a theological view, not a scientific one. And it's perfectly fine to debate that issue. That's a controversial statement, and there's no scientific evidence for or against it at the moment. However, to attack the idea that DNA is a language or that the genetic code is a real code is simply anti-science and should not be done. And that's my point. I would like anybody who sees on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere else on social media the statement that DNA is not a real code, the DNA is just a chemical and all that nonsense, please point them to this video. I hope that they will be convinced that this is a big mistake and it's leading in a very bad direction. And I think that's probably all I need to say at this point. So thank you for watching. Goodbye.